Well, they're calling it Discovery's second pilot, and in this episode we finally actually get to see the USS Discovery. We've got what seems to be a bit of a crazy captain, a ship full of secrets, and Michael Burnham caught up in the middle of it all. Here's my review of the third episode of Star Trek Discovery. Context is for kings. The episode opens 6 months following the previous 2 episodes and the battle at the binary stars. Michael Burnham is en route to a new prison facility after being inexplicably transferred when the shuttle is suddenly threatened by species GS-54, a lifeform that feeds on electricity that threatens to destroy their shuttlecraft. When the pilot is killed trying to eliminate the infestation, the shuttle is rescued by a mysterious starship, which of course turns out to be the titular USS Discovery. Now, I remember when those first test shots of the rough version of the ship first appeared quite some time ago. I was a little worried. I wasn't the biggest fan of the design, and it looked a little strange from certain angles for sure. But this ship, as it's shot here, is gorgeous. I am unapologetically in love with this ship when we first see it in Discovery. Burnham and her fellow convicts are brought aboard the Discovery, and it's noted that the ship appears to be completely brand new, fresh off the assembly line, and yet it's far from the front lines. This is just the first of many mysteries we'll encounter aboard Discovery. We get our first introduction to Rekha Sharma's character, Commander Landry, the Chief of Security for the Discovery. Rekha Sharma is an actress I've liked for quite some time. I really liked her on Battlestar Galactica, and I was excited to see her on the new series. Her character here definitely has an edge, and adding to the mystery, in my opinion, she does not seem to be surprised to see Michael Burnham on the shuttle, almost as though she knew that she was already there. The convicts are led through the Discovery, noting the abundance of silver uniforms and noting that Discovery must be a science ship. One other oddity that they note is this uniform with an obsidian black Starfleet Delta on it. I'm really curious about this, and QMX, I want you to make this because I want one. I've heard some speculation out there that these black badges point to Discovery being a Section 31 vessel. However, for myself personally, I don't think that Section 31 would be quite that overt. People are also pointing to the registry number of 1031 as evidence that this is Section 31. But again, I don't think 31 would be quite that overt about things. And Brian Fuller, when he was still working on the show, mentioned that he had chosen that registry number for different reasons, not in order to tie it to Section 31. In the mess hall, Burnham is surprised to see the former helmsman of the USS Shenzhou, Kayla Detmer, who seemingly survived the battle at the binary stars and is now serving on Discovery. This makes me wonder who else of the bridge crew survived that battle. We will see Saru aboard Discovery as well. He is one of the main cast members. But is there a chance that we'll see any of the others around? In the mess hall as well, we get a glimpse of the food slots at the back of the room. This is the first of many nods to the original series that we'll see in this episode. This room and the food slots look very reminiscent of the rec room on the original Enterprise in Star Trek: The Original Series. Burnham is attacked by the other convicts in the mess hall, and surprisingly, Commander Landry allows this fight to happen, holding back her security officer in order to allow it to continue. This is more evidence that she definitely has a dark side to her character, and I'm really looking forward to learning more about her and why she acts the way she does. She does eventually stop the fight when it's pretty clear that Burnham has gained the upper hand and takes her to visit the captain. Another interesting continuity touchstone happens here when Burnham talks about the martial art that she used to defeat the other convicts. She calls it Susmana, a Vulcan martial art that was introduced in the second season Enterprise episode Marauders. And here we see Saru for the first time since the battle at the binary stars. He is now wearing a command uniform, interestingly enough, and later in the episode we will learn that he is in fact the first officer of Discovery, taking the role that Michael Burnham had left when she committed mutiny. Interestingly, if you've had a chance to read the novel by David Mack, Desperate Hours, you get a bit of backstory as to Commander Burnham's and Commander Saru's vying for the position of first officer on the Shenzhou. They were both up for the job initially, and that novel tells the story of how Burnham became the first officer. It's really interesting, especially if you read that book, to see their roles reversed here. And then we get to meet Captain Gabriel Lorca for the first time, played by British actor Jason Isaacs, affecting a pretty convincing American accent here. Burnham voices many of the things that I suspected when I was watching this episode, that not everything that happened to her aboard the shuttle was in fact an accident. It seems as though she has been brought here on purpose, or at least Burnham suspects that that's the case. On Lorca's desk, we see a tribble. Definitely an interesting touch. This is several years before the episode The Trouble with Tribbles. What does it say about Captain Lorca that he has a tribble on his desk, and it doesn't seem to be breeding out of control? Very interesting. I hope we learn more about the relevance of this later. And from the sounds of it, according to the writers on the show, this is not just a little throwaway thing. This is something that will come into play later. Burnham is assigned to quarters, and we meet another main character from Discovery, Cadet Sylvia Tilly, played by Mary Wiseman. I've seen a bit of negative reaction to this character online, but I love her. I think she's got a really quirky quality to her. She seems really interesting, and I'm really looking forward to learning more about this character. I think in a lot of ways she's probably going to surprise people. I think there is definitely a reason that she is on this ship, and I feel like she's probably a lot more capable than the indications were given here. The awkwardness to me is a lot of fun, and I love that they actually address the oddity of Michael Burnham's name here, and it's a really interesting way to introduce these two characters. There's some speculation out there about Sylvia Tilly and whether she falls on the autism spectrum. Is it possible that Star Trek just introduced a character on the spectrum? It's entirely possible. I'll have a link to that article in the description below. Also, I do want to point out that it seems like an early model for the Tilly character might have been Reg Barclay from Star Trek The Next Generation. There are a lot of similarities between these two characters, and like I said, I really look forward to seeing her character explored more. So here we come to another major mystery of Star Trek Discovery, Black Alert. What is a Black Alert, and what exactly is happening here? We find out later in the episode, of course, what the experiments are that they're doing, but why does it cause this strange effect? The next morning, we have Commander Saru escorting Michael Burnham to her post in engineering. This, I have to say, is one of my absolute favorite scenes in this episode. The acting and the writing in this scene are incredible. And the final line by Saru to Burnham,
"I won't make any trouble for you here."
Well, that is certain. But if you try, know that I intend to do a better job protecting my captain than you did yours.
Was incredibly moving, and it's very apparent that both characters had a difficult time. Saru with telling Burnham this, and Burnham with having to hear it. A beautiful scene and very heart-wrenching. Next, we get our first look at engineering, and again, it has some definite hallmarks that link this show back to the original series. If you look at the reactor area of engineering, it seems very reminiscent of that area behind engineering in the original series that shows the pulsating light from the Enterprise's warp engines. And of course, the next introduction of one of the main characters on Discovery, this time Lieutenant Paul Stamets, whose experiments seem to play a big part in the overall story arc of Star Trek Discovery. It's definitely a rough introduction. He's quite brusque toward Michael Burnham. Of course, given Burnham's status in Starfleet at the moment, that's not entirely unexpected, but it is a very interesting way to introduce this character. Stamets, as you may or may not know, was actually named after a real-life mycologist named Paul Stamets, with some very interesting theories about fungus and spores and mushrooms. I encourage you to check it out. I'll have a link to the Wikipedia page for Paul Stamets in the description below. Another nod to the design of the original series is the data disk that Stamets hands to Michael Burnham. It's definitely somewhat reminiscent of the data cards that we would often see on the Enterprise in the original series that Spock and other characters would use. And another cool continuity reference that I almost missed the first time around, Stamets and his colleague on the USS Glenn discussed the Z Magnes Prize, which is a prize that Dr. Richard Daystrom won, as mentioned in the original series episode The Ultimate Computer. In this scene, we learn about the tragic loss of life aboard the sister ship of the Discovery, the USS Glenn, including, of course, Stamets' colleague that we met in the previous scene. The second mention of Black Alert takes place here. It seems that the crew was lost while the Glenn was on Black Alert maneuvers, according to Lorca. Another really great line by Doug Jones as Commander Saru. I have a feeling this character is going to be a real breakout for this show as long as the acting and the writing keep pace with this, because this is really great when he gives Burnham praise for being the smartest Starfleet officer he's ever known. And Lorca's retort to that when referring to Stamets is pretty funny as well.
Her mutiny aside, she is the smartest Starfleet officer I have ever known.
Huh. And he knows you.
So, based on Saru's ringing endorsement of Burnham, Lorca assigns her to the mission to recover experimental materials from Discovery's sister ship, the USS Glenn. En route, we learn a little bit more about what the Discovery is up to from Lieutenant Stamets, who clearly has a problem with his research being co-opted into a war effort by Starfleet. He has some harsh words for Captain Lorca, calling him a warmonger at one point. Interestingly, the security officers seem to be a little wary of this discussion, and I'm looking forward to seeing that kind of divide between the explorers of Starfleet and the people wanting to do science and the quote-unquote warmongers such as Lorca. I also have to say, this is the kind of storytelling that Star Trek has never really done before, with a few exceptions. If you remember the TNG episode Lower Decks, we get the perspective of people other than the command staff. And it's really interesting, this series seems to be based around that with Michael Burnham here. We get her perspective, but she doesn't really know what's going on yet. We get hints here and there, but it's not spelled out for us because we're not on the inside like we would be on a normal Star Trek series up to this point. I'm really enjoying this, kind of trying to piece it together and figure out the mystery along with Burnham. When the team boards the Glenn, they encounter some strange goings-on. They find a bunch of bodies that seem to have been Cronenberged, for lack of a better term, thanks Rick and Morty. And their injuries seem to correlate with some weird spiral patterns etched into the hull of the Glenn. One of the more bizarre moments of the episode, and also oddly hilarious, is the Klingon warrior that they come across who shushes them before being devoured by a mysterious creature that's rampaging through the hulls. And of course, we get our first red shirt biting it here, although I guess it would be a bronze shirt. I'm not sure what the terminology is going to be here, but regardless, the nameless security officer is dead. The boarding party holes up in engineering while they recover the research that the Glenn was working on, all the while the creature is attempting to get in. I really loved another great line when Burnham attempts to draw the creature off by firing at it to make it angry, and her line, "Shit, that worked," is just perfect for the situation. During the scene in which Burnham is attempting to lure the creature away, we get another really great continuity reference, which I'll get into a little bit later. But she references Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, and again, like I say, this ties really well into Star Trek canon, which I'll get into a little later when it comes up again in the episode. The boarding party narrowly escapes and makes it back to Discovery with the research. And of course, as expected, Lorca asks Burnham to stay with the ship. Burnham, of course, feels that she needs to serve her time in order to atone for what she did in the previous 2 episodes, but Lorca has a really interesting way of convincing her. Burnham thinks that they're doing some sort of illegal weapons testing, but instead it turns out that they're working on a new fungus-based propulsion system, which sounds really fascinating. Lorca shows this to Burnham by putting her in some sort of contraption that allows her to instantaneously glimpse far-off places traveling over the Mycelium network of fungus. I don't know. It's really weird science. I'm not completely up on it, but it sounds really interesting. A very out-there concept, very Star Trek. And this is really cool. We get to see a lot of different locales, some of which are very interesting continuity touchstones in Star Trek. The first location, I'm not entirely sure. It may just be the Parthenon in Greece or the Acropolis. I'm not entirely sure. This may be a real-world location. But the second location is really fascinating. In the background, we see a preserver obelisk, which we see in the original series episode, The Paradise Syndrome, which was left behind by an ancient race called the Preservers that seeded various groups around the galaxy, including a tribe of native North Americans. The third locale she visits appears to be Romulus, although we don't get a great glimpse of it. I think this is Romulus, as we've seen in Star Trek The Next Generation and Deep Space Nine and Nemesis. The fourth one would appear to be Starbase 11 from the episodes Court Martial and the Menagerie in the original series. And the final location, to me, looks a lot like the mining colony on Janus 6 from the TOS episode The Devil in the Dark, the episode where they encounter the Horta. Correct me if I'm wrong, but this really looks like that same location. So Michael Burnham is convinced and stays aboard Discovery. We get a nice little scene between her and Cadet Tilly where she reveals that she will continue to be Tilly's roommate, of course. I'm really looking forward to the relationship between these two. It seems interesting that Burnham might be a sort of mentor character for Cadet Tilly, and Tilly recognizes that before the mutiny, Burnham was a decorated Starfleet officer and a really great asset for the fleet. Once again, Alice's adventures in Wonderland are brought up, and this is where the continuity ties in quite well. This is the first direct reference to Spock, of course, being the foster brother to Burnham.
When I was a kid, after my parents were killed, my foster mother on Vulcan used to read it to me and her son. She and I were the only humans in the house.
What was her name?
Amanda.
Burnham, of course, grew up in the household along with Spock, with Spock's parents, Sarek and Amanda. This is a continuity reference that I was not expecting. We learn in the Star Trek animated series episode, Once Upon a Planet, that Amanda read Alice's Adventures in Wonderland to Spock, and that is directly referenced in this episode. Honestly, the creators of this show are going deep for their continuity references, and this really impressed me. And finally, at the end of the episode, we get a look at what's being called Lorca's menagerie. There are some really interesting tidbits in this room. We see a Gorn skeleton, which, if you watch the after show, After Trek, was confirmed as such by Aaron Harberts. Once again, the writers are aware that first contact with the Gorn didn't happen until the TOS episode Arena, which is purposefully saying something very interesting about Captain Lorca here. What kind of man would have a skeleton of a Gorn in his private study, I guess? This really makes me question what kind of person Lorca is. And of course, we learn here that the security chief, Commander Landry, also beamed aboard the creature that was aboard the Glen before they destroyed the ship. Now, we get a bit better glance at the creature here, and I'm convinced that this is actually a huge tardigrade. If you don't know about tardigrades, they are very tiny animals that are nearly indestructible. They've been known to be able to survive in the vacuum of space and at extreme temperatures and pressures. They're incredibly hardy creatures, and the idea of one that's as large as the creature in this episode is actually pretty terrifying. There is an interview out there with Jason Isaacs where he does make a reference to a tardigrade, which lends further credibility to the idea that this might be what this creature is. Also on display in this room is a dissected Tribble, which may explain how he's able to have one that seems to be spayed and or neutered in his ready room, as well as a Cardassian vole, which was seen in Deep Space Nine. All in all, this was a really interesting episode. I'm really fascinated by the mysteries that they seem to be setting up with this series in a way that I've never really seen Star Trek do before. Star Trek has always been, mostly in the past anyway, about self-contained stories that get resolved one week and then next week we get a new story. But this is a story that's building over the course of the season with all these mysteries and what's going on with the Black Alert and that sort of thing. I love speculating, and I love the idea that the captain is unlike any regular captain we've seen before. He seems to collect both interesting things as well as people. Burnham is just the latest thing that he's added to his collection. And I'm convinced that he totally manipulated the circumstances to have her come aboard when she did. This was not an accident. This was all planned by him. And also, that characteristic in particular seems to fit quite well into continuity. After all, weren't all Starfleet captains other than Kirk in the original series a little bit nuts? So what are your thoughts on the episode Context is for Kings? What do you think is going on Discovery? I'd love to hear your speculations and your thoughts. What did you think of the show? And what do you think will happen in next week's episode with that really compelling title that I'm really curious about? The Butcher's Knife Cares Not for the Lamb's Cry. Sound off in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching. You can follow me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Reddit. Links are all in the description below. I will see you in the next video, and until then, live long and prosper.